Hey friends, it's time to take a closer look at the Vengeance Demon Hunter in the War Within. In this video, we're going to talk about what is changing for the spec moving from Dragonflight into the War Within. We'll talk about both talent trees, the class tree and the spec tree, and take a look at those. We will spend a good amount of time looking at the hero talents because that's the bulk of the changes that are coming for Demon Hunter in the War Within, at least for Vengeance. And then we will talk about the tier set, and finally, wrapping up, we'll talk about how it actually feels to play this class on the beta right now in the War Within. This first section, talking about the changes, is going to be fairly short because not a lot is changing for the Demon Hunter heading from Dragonflight into the War Within. This is largely due to the fact that Vengeance just received a rework to both the class and the spec tree in patch 10.2, which is the last major content update of Dragonflight. Season 3 and Season 4, the spec has been in a phenomenally good place. It has been absolutely dominant in Mythic Plus. You can look at the top pages of tanks on Radar.io. It is just flooded with Vengeance Demon Hunters. On that side, it's a pretty good thing that not a lot is changing for Vengeance. It got some big changes in the middle of Dragonflight, and it's going to continue to be a strong spec foundationally heading into the War Within. On the baseline toolkit, the abilities that you have, nothing is actually changing. In the class tree, again, nothing is actually changing. On the spec tree, there is one change that we need to talk about, and this is kind of a big one, and that is that Illuminated Sigils has been nerfed. If you haven't seen this before, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but double sigils for everything other than Sigil of Flame are now gone. No more double Sigil of Silence, no more double Sigil of Chains, no more double Sigil of Misery, no more double Sigil of Spite. This now only applies to Sigil of Flame. It does reduce the cooldown of Sigil of Flame, and it still brings the parry value. So I think this is still a good talent, but the days of a Vengeance Demon Hunter doing a quadruple pull and single-handedly locking down the pack for the entirety of the Bloodlust window are probably going to be gone. Now, I do want to say about this, Vengeance still does have a lot of tools available to lock down a pack for an extended period of time. You do still have Sigil of Silence, you do still have Sigil of Chains, you do still have Sigil of Misery, and you do still have Chaos Nova. This nerf is going to feel pretty big when you're actually playing the class in the War Within, but I do think that it is still a strength of Vengeance Demon Hunter in its ability to lock down packs for an extended period of time. Now, you're not going to be able to do this nearly to the extent that you can in Dragonflight, and you're going to have to wait to do it again because you're going to have to wait for everything to come off of cooldown, but this is still a strength of the class, and it is going to enable some pulls that other tanks are simply not going to be able to handle on their own. There has been a little bit of a gap closed with Blood Decay now being able to much more easily take Gorfian's Grasp in a Mythic Plus build, and with the talent that turns it into an AoE silence as well. But this is still a strength of Vengeance compared to other tanks. It's just a lot closer now, and it means there's going to be more openings for other tanks to fit into the meta, which I think is a good thing for the state of the game. If you're a longtime Vengeance Demon Hunter enjoyer, then this is going to feel bad, but I don't think it's a bad thing for the state of the game as a whole, and I do think that Vengeance is still going to be a strong option for Mythic Plus, especially heading into the War Within. So with no changes to the baseline toolkit, and with only one change between the talent trees, let's spend some time looking at the hero talent trees, because this is the bulk of where Demon Hunter is getting its changes heading into the War Within. We're going to talk about Fel-Scarred first. The theme of the Fel-Scarred tree is that you are taking Metamorphosis from being an incredibly strong defensive cooldown and turning it into a very potent offensive cooldown as well. So if we look at the first point that we get in the tree here, Metamorphosis now also greatly empowers Soul Cleave and Spirit Bomb. While Demon Form is active, the first cast of each empowered ability induces a Demon Surge, causing you to explode with Fel energy, dealing a ton of fire damage to nearby enemies. So this is going to give you significant offensive value out of your main defensive cooldown, which I think is a really good thing for the state of the class. Metamorphosis is a 2-minute cooldown. You can use it a lot of times throughout a key, and getting big offensive value on it is only going to increase the damage value that you're bringing to your team. Some of the other things that this tree does, we have Focused Hatred, which gives you 35% increased damage on Demon Surge, which is that explosion of damage when you use these empowered abilities for the first time, when it strikes a single target. This gives Blizzard a tuning knob where they can have good AoE value and also increase the single target value of it as they need to. Violent Transformation resets the cooldown of Sigil of Flame and Fel Devastation when you activate Metamorphosis. This is specifically when you hit the Metamorphosis button. This does not apply when you use Fel Devastation to activate Metamorphosis. It does, however, apply when you proc Last Resort, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the bottom of the tree as well. Here we have a choice node where you can either get a little bit more radius and crit damage on Immolation Aura, or you can get a big mastery buff when you use Sigil of Flame, and also good fury generation when you use Sigil of Flame. Lastly, the capstone talent for this hero talent tree also causes Metamorphosis to greatly empower Fel Devastation, Immolation Aura, and Sigil of Flame. In addition to this, each proc of Demon Surge that you get from an ability increases the damage of the next one, so that you're just building up a bigger and bigger Demon Surge through your use of these empowered abilities. A few other significant effects that this hero talent tree has are giving you a kind of micro stagger effect. 5% of all non-fire damage taken with Set Fire to the Pain is taken as fire damage over 6 seconds, and fire damage that you take is reduced by 10%. If there's a boss in War Within that does significant fire damage, this will actually be a really strong talent to take. On the other hand, you could pick up a little bit of additional leech if that's where you'd rather go. The remaining 2 talents on the right side here empower you when you're outside of Metamorphosis. So Enduring Torment gives you more max health and a significant bump in armor when your meta is down. And then Monster Rising gives you 5% more agility when you're not in your Metamorphosis form as well. So these kind of shore up a weakness of Vengeance Demon Hunter historically, which is when your cooldowns are not up, either Demon Spikes or Metamorphosis. You feel very squishy. These are going to reinforce the baseline level of survival that you have in a really positive way. So how does Fel-Scarred feel when you're actually playing it in a dungeon or environment? Now, I've only tested this in dungeons. I haven't done any raid testing because my work schedule just doesn't allow me to make the heroic raid testing, and I just haven't prioritized doing normal raid testing over doing more Mythic Plus testing. But it feels pretty good. You have a frequently available cooldown in Metamorphosis that now gives you big damage. Fel-Scarred feels really good to play. It's fairly passive. The abilities that it empowers are abilities that you're using pretty frequently anyway, but this just gives you a good way to kind of funnel more damage into your Metamorphosis windows. One thing that I would want to note is that Demonic Intensity, which causes Fel Dev, Immolation Aura, and Sigil of Flame to also be empowered. If you proc Last Resort and get that Metamorphosis, it also empowers those abilities. However, if you use Fel Devastation to enter your Metamorphosis form, it will only empower Soul Cleave and Spirit Bomb. It will not empower all of these other abilities, which I think is a fair enough way to balance it. When you get the Metamorphosis from using Fel Devastation, you're not really going to have time to hit every single one of those abilities, so I think it works out just fine. Moving over to the Aldrachi Reaver tree. This tree is all about giving you a super buffed Throw Glaive after consuming either 30 soul fragments or using the hunt, that then enables you to enter a combo, which we'll talk about the 2 possible combos that you can use that will give you different buffs in different scenarios. So when you consume 30 soul fragments or when you cast the hunt, your next Throw Glaive is converted into Reaver's Glaive. Reaver's Glaive enhances your next Soul Cleave and your next Fracture. Let's talk about what the enhancement actually looks like. So this talent here, Fury of the Aldrachi, is what happens when you hit Soul Cleave after you use Reaver's Glaive. This causes Soul Cleave to cast 3 additional glaive slashes to nearby targets, and the glaive slashes that it throws are not the same as your baseline throw glaive. It is like 3 more procs of the Reaver's Glaive. So this does a really big amount of damage in AoE scenarios, and you'll read if you cast this after Fracture, so if your Soul Cleave is the second button in this combo that you hit, you actually cast 6 additional slashes, and again, these can bounce to 3 targets. So in AoE scenarios, what you're probably going to want to do is go Fracture into Soul Cleave, and you'll get a massive burst of AoE damage. I was doing this on some dummies earlier and was getting upwards of 1 million damage just from the additional glaive procs that this was causing. So that's probably the option that you will want to go with in AoE scenarios. In single target scenarios, you will want to do the opposite. You will want to do Soul Cleave into Fracture. When you cast Fracture, the empowered Fracture applies Reaver's Mark to your target, It's just going to be a single target debuff that causes that target to take 15% increased damage for 20 seconds. If you cast this as the second ability in your combo, it gets bumped up to 30% additional damage. We'll have to see what the final tuning looks like here, but I imagine what Blizzard is trying to do is in pure AoE scenarios, so like on trash, you will want to use Fracture and then Soul Cleave to get a big burst of AoE damage. You will still get the 15% buff for using Fracture here. And then in single target scenarios, you will want to use Soul Cleave first and then Fracture, and then you bump the 15% damage up to 30% damage for 20 seconds, which is pretty significant. This is a really nice buff to have. In addition to those two buffs, the capstone talent, Thrill of the Fight, gives you a 15% attack speed buff for 20 seconds and a 30% damage and healing buff for 10 seconds after you have consumed both of these enhancements. So this puts a lot of emphasis into consuming 30 soul fragments in order to build up your access to Reaver's Glaive, which you then hit, and then you execute your combo, either going Fracture into Soul Cleave or Soul Cleave into Fracture, depending on if you want single target or AoE damage. And then you get this big damage buff, and you can essentially go ham for, 10 seconds and then have additional damage for 20 seconds beyond that. There's some other buffs that we want to consider in this tree as well. So going below Reaver's Mark, we have Wounded Quarry, which makes it so that while Reaver's Mark is on your target, your melee attacks strike with an additional Glaive Slash for 7,200 damage and have a chance to shatter a soul. This is just a nice bit of passive extra damage while you have your Reaver's Mark active. And then in addition to that, consuming a soul fragment causes your next Fracture to deal 14,000 additional damage. This is nice. This is just extra passive damage that you get for correctly using your abilities after you've activated and used Reaver's Glaive. On the other side, we're getting increased soul fragment generation from Aldrachi Tactics. The second enhanced ability will shatter an additional soul fragment, and Incisive Blade, which causes Soul Cleave to deal 30% increased damage. This is a big buff to one of our baseline abilities, and it's going to slightly incentivize using Soul Cleave over Spirit Bomb in certain scenarios. We'll have to see how the final tuning on that looks to determine at what target and what soul amount we want to use Soul Cleave over Spirit Bomb. So we'll get a better idea of what the priority there is going to look like as we get closer to release. So Aldrachi Reaver gives you the ability to have these big damage windows, either by consuming 30 soul fragments or by using the hunt. And the addition of the hunt to this ability is key to making it feel good, I think. Building up souls and spending them is something that kind of happens throughout your gameplay, but then having a guaranteed way to activate this on pull is actually really huge. Because 30 soul fragments, you go through a lot of them as a Vengeance Demon Hunter, but 30 is not something that you can quickly get access to and consume in the initial stages of a pull where you're trying to establish aggro, where you may feel a little bit squishy. And so being able to talent into the hunt, use it, and then get your combo going immediately feels really nice. As far as comparing between the two hero talent specs, I think this one was a bit of a toss-up for me. Neither of them really resonated with me in the way that some things like Mountain Thane or Sand Lane have, but I think both of them feel pretty good and fit nicely into the Vengeance Demon Hunter toolkit. I think Fel-Scarred was more enjoyable to me just because Metamorphosis is already such a good defensive button, and giving it a lot of offensive value on top of that is really satisfying and incentivizes you to use it closer to on cooldown, which isn't something that you always want to do with a big defensive ability. Sometimes you need to hold it for a little bit, but having good value and having that choice of, do I want to use this for offensive value and really try to push, even if it's going to create a risky scenario later, or do I need to hold it so that I can ensure we're going to survive and then I'll get some offensive value on it when I finally am able to press it. I think that's an interesting decision to be able to make as a tank. Moving on, let's talk about the tier set. Vengeance Demon Hunter has a little bit more of an active tier set than some of the other tanks, and I'm really not sure how I feel about this one. So let's just read through what it does. The 2 set gives Soul Cleave a, first of all, 15% increased damage, and gives it a 35% chance to shatter 1 lesser soul fragment from a target it hits. Based on testing, this is a 35% chance on use of Soul Cleave and not on targets hit, which I think is probably fine for a 2-piece. If this was a 15% chance or a 35% chance on every target that it hit, you could just do massive pulls and then get really overpowered value out of this for a season 1-2 set. So I think it's okay. the fact that it is kind of a low chance, like 35% is not that high, means that you are going to have spells where you hit Soul Cleave 8-10 times in a row and don't get a proc, and that's not going to feel great. But you generate so many soul fragments that this is just kind of like icing on the cake. It's not great, but it's also not terrible, which is kind of what Blizzard was going for with these tier set bonuses in Season 1. The 4 set, consuming a soul fragment increases the damage and healing of your next Fel Devastation by 2% up to 30%. In my testing, you pretty consistently can get up to or very close to 30% without making any intentional effort to generate and consume soul fragments. I mean, the core gameplay loop and like the way that Vengeance ticks as a class is to proc and then consume these soul fragments anyway. This is just kind of a reward of more Fel Devastation damage for properly executing your rotation. This 4-piece feels pretty good. The one thing that I would say about the 2-piece and the 4-piece is there's a general lack of defensive value that some of the other classes are seeing. However, the defensive value that we're seeing from these tier sets is like 3% damage reduction, so I think getting a little bit more of an interesting set that you can interact with and that you can choose to take advantage of in certain scenarios is probably a good thing for Vengeance. Lastly, let's talk about how Vengeance actually feels to play. This is kind of a tricky one for me because one of the things that I noticed and that I've heard other people talk about as well is the lack of secondary stats that you're going to have in Season 1 feels more noticeable on Vengeance compared to other tanks. I was talking about this on stream the other day. Like, my Vengeance Demon Hunter on live is over 30% haste, I think over 40% crit, around 30% mastery or 30% versatility with some mastery. Mastery is kind of whatever. But going into Season 1, and at least with the itemization that we have on the testing realms right now, in Mythic Plus, I'm rocking like 8% haste and maybe 24% crit. And oh man, does that feel bad. Vengeance typically does scale very well with secondary stats, and going from having like a fully geared Season 4 character to a very under-geared, at least in the item level we can scale to and with the items that we have access to on the testing realm, you feel very, very slow compared to how it feels to play in Season 4. If you, like many others, picked up Vengeance in Season 3 and Season 4 and got used to the very fast-paced feel that it has, where you're constantly generating more resource that you can spend almost, this is going to feel a little bit worse than that. In addition to that, the nerf to sigils also feels very noticeable. One of the things that I've really enjoyed about playing Vengeance in Season 4 of Dragonflight is being able to round up multiple packs and knowing there are 6 casters here that are going to chain cast, but I'm going to be able to stop them until this pack is dead. And that is just not quite something that you're going to be able to do on your own with Vengeance in Season 1 of The War Within. You do still have your Sigil of Silence, which is a 6-second silence. You do still have your Sigil of Misery, although stops in general are getting a nerf. So if a mob, especially in the new dungeons, if a mob is casting something and you use Sigil of Misery, it's not going to put the cast on cooldown. It will try to cast it again when it comes out of that. So that alone is also going to nerf what a lot of other classes and tanks are bringing to the table as far as stops go. But still, being able to stop with Sigil of Misery and then go into a Chaos Nova for an actual stun, and then maybe a Sigil of Chains to move things when they're close to completing the cast, you still have a good ability to kind of carry the interrupts and stops that you need to have. It's just not as potent and noticeable as it is in Season 4 and in Season 3 of Dragonflight. That being said, I think Vengeance feels pretty good. It's not the sturdiest tank, it's not the squishiest tank, but it does bring a level of control to the table that is still a strength among the tanks, and its toolkit is pretty much the same other than the double sigils as it is in Dragonflight right now. If you like the rework that Vengeance got going into Season 3 of Dragonflight, you're probably still going to like the class a lot heading into Season 1 of War Within. How do I rate it personally? As far as my choice among the different tanks is going right now, I think Vengeance is probably going to be on the back burner for me. I don't think it's bad, and I'm not saying this is a judgment of like, this is not going to be the meta tank. It very well may still be the meta, although I don't really see that happening. Tuning adjustments are going to be made. We'll see where all the tanks line up in their power level and their ability to survive and deal out damage. I still think Vengeance has a good toolkit, but I just don't have as much fun on it in Season 1, at least on the beta, as I have in Season 4 in Dragonflight. When I'm playing Vengeance, I find myself thinking I'd just be having a lot more fun if I was playing one of the other tanks. And this is just personal preference. If you enjoy Vengeance, I would encourage you to give it a try. And I'm not trying to say that it's not fun to play. I'm just trying to say that I don't enjoy it as much as I enjoy a lot of the other tanks on the beta right now. I do think Vengeance is in a pretty good place heading into War Within Season 1, and if you like it, I think it is a fine choice that will be able to succeed in high levels of content as you gear up and push into whatever levels you want to go to. If you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching. Please give the video a like and a subscribe for the channel if you haven't already. Really appreciate that. It really helps us out. You can check me out on stream. I'm streaming on YouTube and Twitch 3 to 4 days a week. So feel free to come and hang out and we can chat about tanking or other classes or just whatever you use on your mind and you want to talk about. So thanks again for watching, and until next time, farewell, my friends.